Hey, how are you?
Hi, Chloe.
How are you?
Great. Nice meeting you again.
My mouth is full.
Yeah.
How are you?
Great.
When I step back and think about where we are as a country, and what I found especially over the last 2 years at the State Department as Deputy Secretary, basically traveling around the world. I was gone on the road every 2-3 weeks, is that there is a great debate going on in our country and also in a lot of other countries around the world, and a great new division that has kind of emerged. But it's not the traditional division that we've often seen between left and right, Democrat, Republican, conservative and liberal. It is, as I've seen it, a division between those who, thinking about how do we deal with these incredibly complicated forces of change that are assaulting us, between those on the one hand who feel like the best idea to deal with these forces of change is to play a really strong defense, to kind of hunker down and disconnect, versus those on the other hand who think that the best way to deal with change is for the United States to remain open and connected. In shorthand, it's a division between those who think our future should be shaped by walls and those who think it should be shaped by bridges. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, and I'll come to this. There's a very powerful rationale for those who are attracted to the idea of walls. And in fact, I've seen it pretty much everywhere I've gone, and I see it in this country. You've got this extraordinary pace and scope of change that we're all confronted with in our lives. It's through technology. It's through the unbridled flow of information. It's through the sense that borders are eroding. And all of that, I think, and I'll be curious to get your reaction to this, but for a lot of people, that feeds a sort of sense of chaos and confusion and vulnerability. Add to that the fact that for all the progress that we make, it doesn't get evenly shared and distributed. And that puts fear, resentment, and anger into the mix for a lot of people. Then you've got the fact on top of that, that what we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years is dramatic shifts in power among countries and even, in a sense, beyond them. New powers have emerged on the scene, but particular non-state actors of very different kinds have come into play in ways that they never did before, using the technology, using the information. It might be the mayor of a megacity. It might be the head of a multinational corporation. It might be some kind of super empowered group or individual. And if you're in government, what that means is all of a sudden, all sorts of new actors and people can basically veto the things that you're trying to do. And that makes it a lot more difficult to govern. And that sort of sends a message to people that government's not very effective, it's not very efficient, it can't deliver the results that they want. And that kind of feeds a crisis of confidence in our institutions and our leaders. So I think for all of these reasons, there's been a lot of momentum in the sails of those who think that the best response to all of this is to build a wall. Let's play defense. And they tap into real concerns that I've heard when I travel around the United States, as well as in Europe. All of a sudden, to many people, to many Americans, a refugee becomes a threat to your security, your physical security. An immigrant becomes a threat to your identity. A trade agreement or some kind of new invention becomes a threat to your job. And all of these alliances and international organizations that we've been a part of, that we've led, they just entangle us in other people's problems. They cost a lot of money that would be better spent at home. They lead to a lot of free riders who take advantage of our wealth and prosperity. And so you have the emergence in our politics and in our government of this kind of relentless focus on economic nationalism, on protecting our sovereignty, on protecting our identity. And that leads to practical policies that push back against free trade, that push back against immigration, that push back against globalization. and policies that say we shouldn't be spending our time in these international organizations and these alliances, and we shouldn't really be spending a lot of time trying to spread our values around the world. Let's just hunker down, play defense, and the shorthand is America first. That's basically taken to its extreme, a real difference between what we've had over the last 70 years, which I'll come to, which is this open, connected world where we thought that the world could be organized in a win-win fashion. That is, the success, prosperity, and security of other countries would also be good for us, and vice versa, to a world that's much more Hobbesian, zero-sum, where, again, the best answer to people's problems is to build these walls. So that's how I see the kind of picture that we're faced with right now, and the choice and the debate that's starting to really happen. And part of it played out in our last election. We see it playing out in elections across Europe right now, in France in a few weeks, maybe in Germany in a few months. We just had an election, obviously, in the Netherlands, too, where it played out. Now, just to put my own bias on the table, but I'm really eager for people who disagree to say so and to argue. I think this nationalist, wall-driven vision will run into a barrier of its own that makes it unrealistic, and that barrier is actually reality. When I think about it, and just based on my own experience, if our country, the United States, is disengaged and hunkered down, we'll wind up being worse off even in this much more complicated world. It will be much harder to build the kinds of partnerships that we need to meet a lot of the challenges we face that, even as a superpower, we can't face and deal with alone, and there really is no wall high enough or strong enough to protect us against it. We have to deal, and we'll have to deal in the future, with epidemics that cross frontiers, with hackers that leap firewalls, with terrorists that forge global networks, with aggressive countries that ignore borders. And I believe we have to contend with oceans that rise and a planet that warms. So none of that lends itself to a neat unilateral solution. None of that can be dealt with by trying to stay away from it and be immune to it. The other thing I've learned in 24 years that I've been doing this is that the world isn't self-organizing. It doesn't just happen. Either someone steps up or someone's step up to do the organizing, or one of two things. Either it doesn't happen, and that's a recipe for chaos. Chaos is often filled by a lot of bad things. Or it does happen, but to be nationalistic about it, if we're not the ones doing the organizing, it'll probably be organized in a way that's less conducive to advancing our own interests. So I think we have to be in this mix, and I think that the open, connected country that we built in a more open, connected world is still the right way to go. But that is what is at stake right now. That is what's being argued. That is what's being debated. And just to take you back briefly to where this all started, for the United States, it really started a little over 70 years ago when we emerged from the Second World War. And we had a really big decision to make back then. We emerged as the dominant force in the world. All of the other major powers had either been defeated or so decimated by war that they were in no position to really compete with us. And the folks who were leading the country at that time, I think, had three possible approaches to take. They could have, and actually started to, listen to a really, really strong desire on the part of Americans to just come home. We'd really put ourselves out there in 2 world wars. We hadn't suffered nearly as much as many other countries, but we'd lost a lot of people. An entire young generation had been sent off to war. It was time to come back, bring them back, let's focus on ourselves. And we started to do that. The other possibility was having this incredible power that was really unrivaled. We could basically lord it over every other country and impose our will. But there was a third choice, and ultimately over a few years, especially during the Truman administration, it was this third course that the leaders in this country decided on. And it was not to come home, It was not to impose our will on others. It was to try and take the lead in building an international system with common rules, common norms, institutions, things like the United Nations, like NATO, like the international financial institutions, that would bind everyone, including the United States. And on one level, that seemed to be against our interests because we were subjugating ourselves to the same rules and requirements as everyone else, at least in the theory of this. But the wisdom of it was that traditionally, when one country emerges more powerful than others, throughout history, other countries have banded together to try to check its power. And part of the idea was that in actually creating an open system that anyone could join and that bound everyone to the same rules, including the most powerful country, we could prevent this so-called bandwagoning effect and get others to work with us and try and advance common projects. And for the most part, that system did pretty well. I mean, it got a lot of things wrong, and there was a lot of trial and error along the way. We had a gap between ideals and reality that you could see in many, many places. The sort of remaining vestiges of colonialism that took a long time to get rid of. Apartheid in South Africa that took even longer. For the United States, real challenges in the way we approach particular parts of the world, including Latin America, including Southeast Asia. And of course, a Cold War, an arms race, proxy wars, etc. But, at least in my contention, the big picture that we were trying to fill in came out pretty well. We really wanted to prevent more wars among the great powers that had decimated the first half of the 20th century. And we did. And we wanted to create an open, predictable, rules-based space in which other countries would have a chance to emerge. And by and large, they did. I mean, the second half of the 20th century witnessed a remarkable transition of countries out of abject poverty and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people heading toward the middle class. And that didn't happen in a vacuum, it happened in a structure. And basically, what we hoped and what we saw increasingly throughout the second half of the 20th century was a world in which people, products, ideas, information, capital, moved about relatively freely, relatively securely, based on these rules that we'd helped establish, and guided and protected by institutions in which we played a lead role. And that's really sort of where we are now. And what I'm seeing, and the reason we're having this big debate, is that order is under challenge and it's under threat. It's under threat from the outside by various authoritarian countries, hyper-nationalist countries, as well as non-state actors, who are challenging some of the rules and challenging some of the institutions. And in a sense, from their perspective, the ongoing success of this system is a threat to their own system. The more this model of liberal internationalism is sustained and succeeds, the more difficult it is for them to justify their own models to their own people, so they may have an interest in trying to undermine it. Similarly, terrorist groups and others are trying to test the resilience of the system. And there, if they can get people to doubt that we have the means and ability and will to protect ourselves, that can also undermine the system. And then to circle back to where we started, there are systemic problems that we have to grapple with. And as I said, in a nutshell, for all of the progress we've made, too many people in too many of our countries feel like they're left behind, like they're left out. And they question why we're doing all of this. And if we can't figure out how to answer their questions, then I think the legitimacy of the whole project is in danger. So, to conclude, if the real debate that we're faced with now is between a future of bridge building or wall building on the one hand, and if you're a bridge builder, you have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do to contend with the downsides of all the progress that we've been able to achieve, to contend with the concerns of those who are left out, left behind. How do we, for example, manage the three great migrations of our time? migration of people, and we can come to that, and we will in a couple of weeks, of goods, products, and of ideas and information, because for all the positives, they do bring with them real challenges. How do we think about what role the United States should be playing in international organizations and institutions and alliances in continuing to try to shape or lead them? And finally, and maybe most importantly, for those of us who are on the bridge building side, how do we better engage our fellow citizens to do a much better job understanding their concerns, addressing their concerns, and hopefully convincing them of the benefits of a country that remains open and connected to the world in a world that remains increasingly open and connected. In short, for me, this is a little bit like a period that many of you probably studied, or if not, will study. And that's a period that really started a little over 100 years ago, when capitalism was flourishing in this country, but in a sense over-flourishing. And it was creating tremendous wealth, concentrated in a relatively small number of hands, but it was also doing damage to a lot of people at the same time in its excesses. And so we had a progressive era in this country that tried to round off the rough edges of capitalism and, in effect, save it. And that was followed over this lengthy period of about 40 years with the New Deal, which had the same basic purpose and same basic effect, which was to make sure that people in a capitalist system were nonetheless protected from its downsides. And I think that between progressivism and the New Deal era, we basically saved capitalism from itself, and it was able to flourish. Now, everything that we've stood for the last 70 plus years in building this open and connected world needs something similar, I think, if it's going to retain its legitimacy and retain the support of people in this country and people in countries around the world.